I need to tell you about something that happened in the mountains of eastern Kentucky in 1950, something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it too long. The official records say one thing, but the people who were actually there, the ones still alive anyway, they tell a different story entirely. My grandfather was part of that search party. He died in 1987, but before he went, he made me promise to write this down. People need to know, he said, gripping my hand with fingers that had never quite worked right since that spring. Not the sanitized version they put in the papers. The truth. So here it is. The truth. It started when the Henderson children disappeared. March 15th, 1950, Harlan County, Kentucky. 3 kids, Emma, 12, Thomas, 9, and little Sarah Henderson, 6, vanished while walking home from the one-room schoolhouse in Kettle Creek. The path they took every single day, the same route their father had walked as a boy, the same dirt road that half the county used. They left school at 3:30 p.m. They never made it home. Their mother, Ruth Henderson, wasn't worried at first. Kids got distracted. They'd probably stopped to skip stones in the creek or chase after some animal. But when the sun started setting and they still weren't home, she sent her husband John out looking. He came back 2 hours later, white as a sheet, saying he'd found Thomas's lunch pail by the old Mackey property, right where the road curved past what locals called the Devil's Sinks. Now, I need to explain something about sinkholes in Appalachia, because it's important to understand what we're dealing with here. This isn't like the sinkholes you see on the news today, swallowing Florida homes. These are ancient. These are different. The limestone underneath those mountains has been dissolving for millions of years, creating vast underground networks that make Swiss cheese look solid. Some of the caves go down hundreds of feet. Some of them have never been fully explored, even now in 2026. The Devil's Sinks were a cluster of 7 major sinkholes scattered across about 40 acres of forest. Everyone knew about them. Everyone stayed away. There were stories, of course. There are always stories in the mountains, but these weren't just tales to scare children. These were warnings. Old-timers said things went into the Devil's Sinks that didn't come out. Not just things that fell in by accident, mind you, things that were drawn in. Livestock would wander off in that direction and disappear. Dogs would track a scent to the edge of one of those holes and refuse to go further, whimpering and pulling back with their tails between their legs. Even birds didn't like to fly over them. But by 1950, that was all dismissed as superstition. This was modern America. We'd just won a world war. We had electricity and automobiles, and soon we'd have television. We didn't believe in mountain curses anymore. We should have. The search party assembled the next morning, March 16th. 47 men, my grandfather among them. He was 28 then, strong, capable, a veteran who'd seen combat in Europe. He thought he knew what fear was. He told me later he'd been wrong about that. They divided into groups, each taking a section of the woods. My grandfather's group had 12 men, and they were assigned the area around the Devil's Sinks. None of them wanted it, but someone had to check, and they had rope and lanterns and enough good sense to be careful. Or so they thought. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw led the group. He was a big man, 6'4", hands like ham hocks, with a voice that could carry across a holler. He'd been sheriff for 15 years and didn't put much stock in the old stories. Sinkholes are sinkholes, he said that morning. They're dangerous, sure, but they're just geology. Nothing more to it than that. They reached the first sinkhole around 9 a.m. My grandfather described it to me once, and I wrote it down word for word. It looked like God had taken his finger and just pressed it down into the earth. Perfectly circular, about 30 feet across at the rim, narrowing as it went down. The sides were smooth limestone, almost polished looking. Trees grew right up to the edge and then just stopped, like they knew better than to get closer. And the smell coming up out of it. Jesus, the smell, like a root cellar that hadn't been opened in 50 years, mixed with something metallic. Copper, maybe, or blood. They called down into it. Their voices echoed back strange, distorted, like they were being played on a record at the wrong speed. No answer from the Henderson kids. They moved to the second sinkhole, then the third. Same story each time. Deep, dark holes dropping into the earth, swallowing light and sound, giving nothing back. It was at the fourth sinkhole that they found the first real clue. Thomas's shoe, a small brown leather shoe, scuffed and worn, sitting on a flat rock about 20 feet down the side of the hole. Not dropped there, placed there, deliberately positioned in the exact center of the rock, toe pointing toward the depths. That's when the sheriff's attitude changed, my grandfather told me. He got real quiet, pulled out his revolver, checked the cylinder, put it back in his holster. Then he said, "We're going down." They drew straws. My grandfather, Sheriff Bradshaw, and a coal miner named Pete Sullivan got the short ones. Pete knew rope work from the mines, so he'd manage the descent. My grandfather and the sheriff would be the ones actually going into the hole. Looking back now, with everything I've learned about cave rescue and safety protocols, what they did was insane. They had basic climbing rope, hand-crank lanterns, and absolutely no proper equipment. No helmets, no harnesses, no backup lines, no communication system. Just 3 men and their determination to find those kids. But you have to understand the mindset. This was rural Kentucky in 1950. These were men who'd grown up during the Depression, fought in World War II, worked in coal mines where death was just part of the job. They didn't think in terms of safety protocols. They thought in terms of doing what needed to be done. Pete anchored the rope around a thick oak tree. My grandfather went first, the rope tied around his waist, lantern hanging from his belt. Hand over hand, feet braced against the limestone walls, down into the dark. He told me the temperature dropped the moment his head went below the rim. Must have been a pleasant 70 degrees in the sun, but down there it felt like 50, maybe colder. The air was damp and tasted wrong. He couldn't quite describe it, but it wasn't like normal cave air. There was something else mixed in, something that made his tongue feel thick and his throat want to close up. 20 feet down, he reached the rock where Thomas's shoe sat. Up close, he could see it wasn't just placed there randomly. It was positioned with unnatural precision, and around it, scraped into the limestone, were symbols. Not English letters, not any alphabet my grandfather recognized. Just strange angular marks that seemed to shift when the lantern light hit them at different angles. He grabbed the shoe, put it in his jacket pocket, and kept descending. 30 feet down, the sinkhole opened up. The narrow shaft widened into a larger chamber, and my grandfather found himself dangling in open space. He swung the lantern around, trying to see the extent of it, and that's when he realized this wasn't just a sinkhole. It was an entrance. The chamber was huge, maybe 50 feet across, with passages leading off in 3 different directions. The walls weren't natural limestone formations, they were too regular, too smooth. And they were carved. Every inch of them was covered in the same strange symbols he'd seen around the shoe, thousands upon thousands of them, spiraling and intersecting in patterns that hurt to look at too long. "Bradshaw," he called up, "you need to see this." The sheriff came down cursing the whole way. When he swung into the chamber and saw what my grandfather was seeing, he went silent. Just hung there on his rope, lantern in one hand, the other gripping his revolver. "What in the hell is this?" he finally said. They secured the rope and dropped to the chamber floor. It was covered in a layer of fine white powder that puffed up around their boots when they walked. Not limestone dust. My grandfather said it felt more like ash or bone ground, incredibly fine. Their lanterns cast wild shadows across the carved walls, making the symbols seem to writhe and move. 3 passages. They had to choose one. The middle passage showed what looked like scuff marks in the powder, recent ones. That's the way they went. I want to pause here and talk about something my grandfather emphasized when he told me this story. He said the hardest part wasn't the darkness, or the creepy symbols, or even the growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. The hardest part was the silence. Total silence doesn't exist in nature. There's always something. Wind, water, insects, birds, the settling of earth and stone. But in that passage, there was nothing. Their footsteps should have echoed. Their breathing should have reverberated off the walls, but the sound just died, swallowed up by something that shouldn't have been possible. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, going deeper and deeper. The passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, smooth and even, clearly man-made, but ancient beyond reckoning. The symbols continued along the walls, changing in pattern and density. Sometimes they were sparse, just occasional marks. Sometimes they crowded together so thickly the limestone underneath was barely visible. Then they started hearing the singing, not hearing it with their ears exactly. My grandfather struggled to explain this part. It was more like the singing was already inside their heads and they were just becoming aware of it. A single voice, high and clear, singing syllables that weren't quite words in a melody that wasn't quite music. It made their teeth ache and their eyes water, but they couldn't stop walking toward it. The passage opened into another chamber, and this is where the official story and the truth diverge completely. The official report says they found the Henderson children in a natural cave formation, suffering from exposure and dehydration, but otherwise unharmed. The report says they were disoriented and couldn't explain clearly what had happened, that they'd apparently wandered into the sinkhole system and gotten lost. The report says the search party brought them out safely and everyone went home. That's what the newspapers printed. That's what went into the county records. That's the lie. Here's what actually happened. The chamber was circular, about 100 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose 30 feet overhead. In the exact center was a pit, maybe 15 feet across, dropping down into blackness that their lanterns couldn't penetrate. And around the pit, in a perfect circle, sat the Henderson children. Not huddled together, scared, not crying or calling for help. Sitting cross-legged, evenly spaced, absolutely still, staring down into the pit. Their eyes were open but unfocused, and they were singing. That same, not quite music, my grandfather and the sheriff had heard in the passage, coming from all three children in perfect unison. "Emma," Sheriff Bradshaw called out. No response. The children didn't even blink. My grandfather and the sheriff approached carefully. As they got closer, they could see the children were sitting on symbols carved into the floor, larger and more elaborate than any they'd seen so far. And the children themselves, their skin looked wrong. Too pale, almost translucent, with dark veins showing underneath like spiderwebs. Their lips were cracked and bleeding, but they didn't seem to notice or care. The sheriff reached Emma first. He put his hand on her shoulder and she stopped singing. Her head turned toward him with a mechanical precision that wasn't natural, and when she looked at him, my grandfather said her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, from lid to lid, like someone had filled the sockets with ink. "She's waiting," Emma said, but it wasn't Emma's voice. It was dozens of voices speaking in unison, men and women and children, echoing out of this 12-year-old girl's throat. "She's been waiting so long, we promised her 3. 3 pure ones, 3 to open the way." The sheriff jerked his hand back. "What did you do to these kids?" "We didn't do anything," the voices said through Emma. "They came willingly. They heard her calling, and they came, just like the others. Just like all the others, all through the years. The livestock, the wanderers, the ones who got too close and heard her song." That's when my grandfather made the connection. All those disappearances over the years, the animals and occasional people who vanished near the Devil's Sinks. They hadn't fallen in by accident. They'd been called. "Who's calling them?" my grandfather asked. "Who's she?" Emma's head tilted at an angle that would have broken a normal person's neck. "The old hungry one, the sleeper beneath. The first mother. She has so many names and none at all. She's been here since before the mountains rose. The people who came before knew her. They carved these walls to contain her, to keep her sleeping. But the seals weaken, the songs fade. And when she's hungry enough, when she dreams deep enough, her voice leaks through and calls the pure ones to feed her." "Feed her what?" Sheriff Bradshaw's voice shook. "Life, innocence, the energy of souls not yet tainted by the world's sins. Children are best. Children believe. Children don't question. Children come when called." The sheriff drew his revolver. "You let those kids go right now, or I swear—" "You swear what?" The voices laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "You'll shoot a child. You'll murder a little girl to save her. We're just the voice. We're just the messenger. She's down there waiting, always waiting, and they've already given themselves. The moment they sat on the marks, the moment they began to sing, they became the offering." My grandfather said this is when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were more symbols around the pit, different from the others. And in the spaces between the symbols, the rock was stained. Dark brown stains, centuries old, that could only be one thing. Blood, lots of it. This wasn't the first time this chamber had been used for whatever ritual was taking place. But here's the thing about my grandfather. He was a practical man. He'd seen evil before, in the war, in the form of very human atrocities. And whatever this was, whether it was some ancient entity or mass hallucination or something else entirely, there were still 3 kids in danger, and he wasn't leaving without them. He lunged forward and grabbed Thomas, throwing the boy over his shoulder. Thomas started screaming, not in fear, but in rage, thrashing and clawing, still singing that horrible song. The sheriff grabbed Sarah, and she did the same thing. Emma stood up on her own, still staring at them with those black eyes. "You can take them," the voices said through her, "but they're already hers. They'll never be right again. They'll hear her calling for the rest of their lives, and when they're old enough, when the weight of the world has made them impure, she'll take them anyway. She always does." "We'll see about that," the sheriff said, and he grabbed Emma's arm. The moment he touched her, something rose from the pit. My grandfather only got a glimpse of it, and he said for the rest of his life he was grateful for that. It wasn't a physical thing, not exactly. It was more like a presence, a wrongness in the shape of something vast. He had an impression of size, of something impossibly huge wedged into a space far too small for it, and of hunger. An endless consuming hunger that had been waiting in the dark for longer than human civilization had existed. And it screamed, not with sound, but with something deeper, a psychic shriek that made their ears bleed and their minds fracture at the edges. The lanterns exploded, plunging them into absolute darkness. My grandfather said he ran in what he hoped was the direction of the passage, carrying Thomas, who fought him every step. He could hear the sheriff behind him and Emma screaming, really screaming now in her own voice, terrified and confused. He ran through the dark with his hands outstretched, bouncing off walls, falling, getting up, running more. Behind them, from the chamber, came a sound like the earth itself was tearing apart. The walls shook, dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling, and underneath it all, that singing continued, louder now, hungry, furious at being denied. They made it to the rope by pure luck. The men at the top had heard the commotion and were hauling like their lives depended on it. My grandfather, the sheriff, and the 3 children were pulled up through the shaft in a tangle of limbs and rope, scraping against the limestone walls, not caring about the pain, just desperate to reach sunlight. When they broke the surface, all 3 children collapsed. Their eyes were normal again, frightened and confused, but normal. They were crying, shaking, with no memory of how they'd gotten into the sinkhole or what had happened down there. The last thing any of them remembered was walking home from school and hearing what they thought was their mother calling them from the woods. The men wanted to go back down to see what was in that chamber, to understand what they'd encountered. But Sheriff Bradshaw forbade it. He had the sinkhole filled in that very day, using county equipment to dump truckload after truckload of rock and concrete into it. Then he had all 7 of the Devil's Sinks filled, every single one, until they were just depressions in the ground, covered with dirt and newly planted grass. The official story was written. The Henderson children were found, everyone was safe, case closed. Anyone who talked about what had really happened was dismissed as superstitious or attention-seeking. The symbols carved in the walls, never mentioned. The pit, never existed. The thing that rose from it, mass hallucination from bad air. But here's what the official records don't show. Here's what my grandfather made me promise to document. The Henderson children were never the same. Emma stopped talking entirely for 3 years. When she finally spoke again, it was only in whispers, and she refused to be in complete darkness for the rest of her life. She slept with every light in her house on until she died of a heart attack at 47. Thomas developed seizures, violent ones, where he would speak in languages no one recognized and draw those same symbols they'd seen in the caves. He spent most of his adult life in and out of psychiatric hospitals. He hanged himself in 1972. Sarah, the youngest, seemed to cope the best initially. She grew up, got married, had children of her own. But in 1983, at age 39, she walked away from her home in Cincinnati and was found 3 weeks later in eastern Kentucky, standing at the edge of where one of the filled-in sinkholes had been. dirt under her fingernails from trying to dig it back open. She kept saying, "She's calling again," over and over. Sarah was institutionalized and died there in 1996. Of the 12 men who went into that sinkhole, 8 developed severe psychological problems. 3 committed suicide. My grandfather's hands never worked right because of how tightly he'd gripped that rope during the escape. The doctors said it was psychosomatic, that there was no physical reason for the nerve damage, but the pain was real enough. Sheriff Bradshaw resigned 6 months after the incident. He moved to Florida and refused to ever talk about what happened. He died in 1968, and his family said that even on his deathbed, when he was barely conscious from the morphine, he kept mumbling about keeping it sealed. Now let me tell you the part that still gives me nightmares. In 1967, 17 years after the sinkholes were filled in, a surveying team was working in that area for a proposed highway expansion. They used ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface. What they found made them stop the project entirely. The sinkholes hadn't been isolated pits. They'd all been connected by a massive underground complex that spread for miles beneath that section of Harlan County. And at the center of it all, directly beneath where the filled-in 4th sinkhole had been, the radar showed a cavity the size of a cathedral. The walls of this cavity were too regular to be natural, and something was moving inside it. Not geological movement, not water flow. Movement that the radar picked up as rhythmic, pulsing, like breathing. The survey team's findings were classified immediately. The highway was rerouted, the land was purchased by the federal government through a shell corporation and designated as protected wilderness. No development, no camping, no hiking. They put up fences and no trespassing signs, and if you go there today, you'll find park rangers who take their jobs very seriously. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The movement hasn't stopped. Every few years, someone with the right equipment takes readings, and that same rhythmic pulsing is still there. And it's getting stronger. My grandfather told me that whatever's down there, the old people who carved those warnings knew about it. They found a way to contain it, to keep it sleeping, but they couldn't kill it. Maybe it can't be killed. And the rituals they performed, the maintenance of those seals, that knowledge was lost centuries ago when the European diseases wiped out the indigenous populations of Appalachia. Those sinkholes weren't random geological formations. They were breathing holes, pressure releases, carefully positioned to let just enough energy escape that the thing underneath wouldn't build up enough pressure to break free entirely. By filling them in, we didn't solve the problem. We made it worse. We blocked the release valves, and now all that pressure has nowhere to go except to build and build and build. I've done research, more than I probably should have. The Henderson children weren't the first disappearances in that area, and they weren't the last. Every 15 to 20 years, going back as far as records exist, there's been an incident. Sometimes it's children, sometimes it's adults who went hiking and never came back. Sometimes it's entire families who moved into that region and just vanished, houses left empty with food still on the table, and the time between incidents is getting shorter. The most recent was 2019, a group of spelunkers exploring the cave systems, legally or not, I'm not sure, in that area. 5 people went in, 3 came out, and they wouldn't talk about what happened to the other 2. They're all in psychiatric care now, and the reports that leaked say they exhibit the same symptoms the Henderson children had. Night terrors, speaking in unknown languages, drawing symbols, periods of catatonia where they just stare at nothing and sing. I've also found similar patterns in other parts of Appalachia. Different locations, but the same basic structure. Ancient sinkholes, disappearances, official cover-ups, and surviving witnesses who are never quite right afterwards. Wise County, Virginia in 1934. Avery County, North Carolina in 1958. Pocahontas County, West Virginia in 1981. The details change, but the core story is always the same. Something is under those mountains. Multiple somethings maybe, or maybe it's all the same thing, spread out across the entire Appalachian range like a mycelium network. The indigenous peoples who lived here before European contact had 1,000 different names for it in 100 different languages. But they all understood the same basic truth. There are old things in the deep places, things that were here before humans and will be here after we're gone, and the best thing we can do is leave them alone. But we didn't leave them alone. We filled in their breathing holes. We drilled into their chambers, looking for coal and natural gas. We blasted their mountains apart for minerals. We built highways and strip malls and housing developments on top of their sacred containment sites. And now they're waking up. I think about the Henderson children a lot. I think about how they were just walking home from school, probably talking about normal kid things, when they heard what sounded like their mother calling them. How natural and innocent that must have seemed. How there was no reason not to investigate, no warning sign that would have made sense to a child's mind. That's the truly horrifying part, isn't it? The thing below didn't need to be sophisticated. It didn't need elaborate traps or complex lures. It just needed to sound like someone you trusted, calling you home. And in that moment of trust, in that instant of believing the familiar voice, you were already caught. I wonder how many times it's worked, how many people over the centuries heard their name called from the dark and walked willingly toward it. How many offerings were made, intentionally or not, to something that should never have been disturbed in the first place. My grandfather's last words to me were, "Don't go looking for it. Don't go digging into things that are meant to stay buried. But if you hear your name called from somewhere you know no one should be calling from, run. Don't hesitate, don't question it, don't try to investigate, just run and don't look back." I've followed that advice, but I've also kept records. I've documented every story I could find, every incident that matches the pattern, every piece of evidence that points to the same conclusion. Because even though my grandfather told me not to dig, he also told me to write this down, to make sure someone knows the truth. And maybe that's the real purpose of this account. Not to warn people to stay away, though you absolutely should, but to create a record that might help someone in the future. Because the incidents are increasing. The time between them is shortening, and sooner or later, something is going to break through completely. When that happens, when the thing that's been sleeping under Appalachia for eons finally wakes up fully, people will need to know what they're dealing with. They'll need to know that this isn't new, that it's been building for a long time, and that we've ignored the warnings every step of the way. The official story says the 1950 search party found 3 children safe in a cave. The truth is, they found something far worse. Proof that we're living on top of something ancient and hungry, something that views human life the way we view cattle, and something that's been patient enough to wait centuries between meals, but is starting to get impatient. Those symbols carved in the limestone walls weren't decorations. They were warnings. They were instructions for maintaining seals we no longer understand. They were the last desperate message from people who knew what was down there and did everything they could to protect future generations from it. We didn't listen. We filled in the sinkholes, paved over the sacred sites, and dismissed the old stories as superstition. And now, 76 years after my grandfather descended into that darkness, the thing he found is still there, still pulsing, still breathing, still calling, and people are still hearing their names in the dark. I'll leave you with one final thought, something that occurred to me while writing this. What if the Henderson children weren't victims? What if they were volunteers? Not consciously, of course, but on some level their souls recognized the call and responded to it. What if there's something in certain people, some genetic or spiritual marker, that makes them susceptible to that song from the deep places? And what if that trait can be inherited? Sarah Henderson's children are still alive. Emma never had kids, and Thomas's died young, but Sarah had 3 daughters before she walked back to Kentucky and tried to dig up that sinkhole. Those daughters have children now. Grandchildren, all of them living normal lives, scattered across the country, probably not even knowing their family history. But I know. I've tracked them. And I've noticed a pattern. They're all drawn to caves. Not professionally, they're teachers and accountants and engineers, but as a hobby. They go spelunking on weekends. They take vacations to Carlsbad Caverns and Mammoth Cave. They post pictures from underground adventures on social media, smiling faces in headlamps descending into the dark. And sometimes, late at night, they post things that worry me. Comments about hearing voices in the deeper caves. Questions about whether other people experience a pull toward certain tunnels. A feeling that something's calling them deeper. Casual mentions of dreams where they're singing in languages they don't know. I've tried to warn them. sent anonymous messages, shared articles about cave safety, even told a few of them directly about their grandmother's history. Some blocked me, some thanked me politely and ignored the warnings. One, Sarah's youngest granddaughter, a 23-year-old named Emily, wrote back and said she already knew. She said she'd been hearing the song her whole life, and she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She said it was beautiful. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't heard from Emily since. Her social media has gone dark. Her friends say she mentioned a solo cave exploration trip in eastern Kentucky, but didn't give specifics about where. And the seismic monitors in Harlan County, the ones the government doesn't officially acknowledge, they've been showing increased activity. That same rhythmic pulsing, stronger than ever, like a heartbeat building toward a crescendo. I think something's about to happen. I think the waiting is almost over. And I think Emily might have just become the first willing sacrifice in a new cycle. So that's what the 1950 search party found in the deep Appalachian sinkholes. They found proof that there are things in this world older and stranger than we can comprehend. Things that don't die or fade or forget. Things that are patient enough to wait lifetimes between feedings, and things that are starting to wake up. They found the truth that we've spent 76 years trying to bury, just like we buried those sinkholes under tons of rock and concrete. But you can't kill something by covering it up. You can only postpone the inevitable. The question now isn't whether it will break through. The question is when, and how many people it will take with it when it does. My grandfather knew this. That's why he made me write it down. Not to scare people, though you should be scared, but to create a record. So when it happens, when the news reports start coming in about disappearances in Appalachia, about sinkholes suddenly opening up, about people hearing songs in the dark and walking willingly into the earth, you'll know it isn't random. You'll know it's been building for a very long time. And you'll know that the old stories weren't superstition. They were history. So if you ever find yourself in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, or anywhere else in Appalachia for that matter, and you hear your name called from somewhere you know no one should be, remember what my grandfather said: run. Don't question it. Don't investigate it. Don't try to rationalize it. Just run and don't look back, because whatever's calling you has been waiting a very long time for an answer, and it's very, very hungry. The 1950 search party found 3 children and brought them back to the surface. But they left something behind down there in the dark. The truth about what's really underneath these ancient mountains, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes the things we bury don't stay buried. They just wait, and wait, and wait, until they don't have to wait anymore.